The wedding dress was still buttoned when Mabel Crane sat down on the kitchen floor. Not collapsed, sat, deliberately, the way a woman sits when she has decided that the floor is the most honest place available, and the chair is asking too much of her. The dress was ivory wool, cut wide across the shoulders, and it had taken her 4 months to make it. Outside, the October wind was doing something purposeful to the cottonwood tree. The church was 3 miles back down the road. Nobody had followed her. She had walked the 3 miles in wedding dress and good boots, and nobody had followed. And now she was on the kitchen floor of a borrowed cabin with her back against the cold stove, and she was still completely, terribly composed. If that image already has hold of you, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Every name, every city, it means more than you know. Stay with me. Because what happened in that church in Copper Falls 3 hours ago, and what is about to happen on the road between that church and this mountain, is going to change the way you think about dignity, about worth, and about what a man can say without using a single word. Mabel Crane had come to Copper Falls, Wyoming territory, the way most practical women came to frontier towns, not for love and not for adventure, but because the circumstances of her life had narrowed to a single corridor, and at the end of that corridor was a corridor she could walk. She was 34 years old. She had been a school teacher in Kansas for 9 years, which was long enough to understand children and short enough to still find them interesting. She had supported her mother through a 2-year illness that took everything they had saved, and then some. And after the burial, she had written to the Wyoming Territorial Teachers Registry and accepted the first placement offered. Copper Falls, population 412, 1 schoolhouse, no library, but a lending arrangement with the mercantile that the previous teacher had established and that Mabel intended to expand. She had been in Copper Falls for 11 months when Jesse Holt came to speak to her after the autumn school exhibition. He was not what she would have designed if she were designing. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet because they are withholding, and others are quiet because there is simply a great deal going on underneath that has not yet found its way to the surface. She could not tell, that first evening, which kind he was. He had a daughter in her classroom, Rosie, 7 years old, serious as weather, with the particular self-sufficiency of a child who has learned that waiting for help is slower than managing alone. His wife had died of a fever in the spring of 1884. He had been managing the property and the child and the grief for 2 years and 4 months. And it showed, not in his face, but in the quality of his attention, which was present but rationed, like a man who has learned to be careful about what he spends. He courted her, if that was the word. Over the course of 5 months, Sunday visits, 2 letters, 1 evening at the settlement dance where he stood beside her for most of it without dancing, and she found she did not mind. She had not expected to feel anything particular about it. She felt something particular about it. She said yes in August, in the kitchen of her boarding house, with her hands still floury from bread she had been making when he arrived, and he had looked at her hands and then at her face and nodded once. And that had been that. The wedding was planned for the first Sunday in October, which was Reverend Albright's idea, because October in the valley was beautiful, and he liked to perform ceremonies against beautiful backdrops. 43 people came. Mabel had known it would be a subject of discussion. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman, and a wedding dress requires the whole of a woman to be visible in a way that daily life does not. She had made the dress herself precisely because she trusted her own hands more than she trusted Copper Falls to produce a seamstress who would not make her feel like a problem to be solved. The dress was good. She knew it was good. What she had not accounted for was Ida Marsh. Ida Marsh was Jesse Holt's late wife's sister, which gave her a proprietary interest in Jesse's future that she had been nursing for 2 years, and which she had apparently decided, in the 3 weeks since the wedding was announced, to exercise publicly and without restraint. She was a small, precise woman who wore her opinions the way other women wore jewelry, visibly, and with the expectation that they would be admired. She had said nothing to Mabel directly in the 11 months they had occupied the same town. She had said a great deal to everyone else. What she said at the altar, or rather, what she said to the woman beside her in the second pew as Mabel walked the aisle, in a voice calibrated precisely to Carrie, was not, in isolation, the worst thing anyone had ever said. It was the laughter that followed. That was the thing. Not one voice, but 6, then 8, the sound moving through the pews like a wave finding a shore, and then a young man near the back who was not laughing but covering his mouth, which was almost worse. Mabel heard it begin and felt it move and understood in the space of 3 steps exactly what was happening and what it meant. She did not stop walking. She reached the altar. She stood where she was supposed to stand. She looked at Reverend Albright's face, which had gone the color of a man who wants very badly to be somewhere else, and then at Jesse Holt's face, which had gone the color of a man who has heard something and is in the process of deciding what to do about it, and that process was not going quickly enough. The laughter had settled into something worse than laughter, a charged, waiting silence, the kind that happens when a room understands that a choice is being made. Mabel Crane waited 4 seconds. She had counted them the way she counted things, not from fear, but from precision, from the habit of a woman who had learned that measuring a moment before you act in it is not cowardice, but arithmetic. In those 4 seconds, Jesse Holt did not move. He did not speak. He looked at her with something working behind his eyes that she could not read and would not wait for. She said quietly to Reverend Albright, "I beg your pardon. I need a moment." She turned. She walked back down the aisle. 43 people watched her go. Nobody reached for her arm. Nobody said her name. She reached the church door, pushed it open, and walked out into the October morning, which was cold and indifferent, and which did not have an opinion about her dress. She walked 3 miles in that dress and those good boots, and she did not cry until she was certain she was far enough from the road that no passing wagon could see her. And then she cried for 7 minutes, which was all she allowed. Then she stopped. Then she found the borrowed cabin that had been arranged for the wedding night, belonging to a friend who was not, she realized now, actually a friend, and she let herself in with the key she still had in her coat pocket, and she sat down on the kitchen floor. She was still there 2 hours later when she heard the horse. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of a horse ridden fast and then pulled up short, the way a man pulls a horse when he has arrived somewhere and is not entirely certain of his welcome. She did not get up from the floor. She heard the porch, his boots on the 3 steps, and then a long silence where the door was, and then a single knock. She said nothing. He let himself in. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her on the floor for a moment, not with the look of a man cataloging damage, but with the look of a man who is making room inside himself for the size of what he is seeing. He was still in his wedding clothes. He had not changed. He had ridden hard. She could see it in the dust on his coat. "I should have spoken," he said. She looked at the middle distance to the left of him. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He crossed the kitchen and sat down on the floor beside her. Not in a chair, on the floor. His back against the cold stove the same as hers. They sat like that for a long time without speaking, and the October wind did its work on the cottonwood outside, and Mabel Crane stared at the grain of the floorboards and tried to decide what she thought about this, which was complicated. "Rosie asked where you were," he said finally. "Before I left. What did you tell her?" "That I was going to find you." A pause. She said, "Good." Mabel said nothing for a moment. "Then, your sister-in-law is going to make the next several years of your life very difficult. She's been making it difficult for 2 years." He turned his head and looked at her. She felt it, but did not return it yet. "I should have spoken before the ceremony. I knew what Ida was saying around town. I thought if I ignored it, it would stop." "It doesn't stop," Mabel said. "It waits. I know that now." She looked at him then. His face was exactly what it always was, steady and contained, with the particular quality of a man who has not been broken by the things that have happened to him, only made very careful. He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm not going back to that church today," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I don't know what I'm asking for." "I know," he said. "That's all right." She looked at him for another moment. Then she got up off the floor, not gracefully. It was a floor and a wool dress, and dignity is what you maintain in your expression rather than your movements. And she went to the stove and looked at what was in it, which was nothing, and opened the cabinet beside it, and took inventory of what was there, which was better than nothing. Someone had stocked it for the wedding night. There were apples. There was flour and good lard. There was a jar of cinnamon and one of brown sugar and a tin of salt. "I'm going to cook something," she said. He said, from the floor, "All right." She built the fire herself. He rose after a moment and brought in wood from the porch, without being asked, and stacked it beside the stove, and then stayed out of her way, which she appreciated. She peeled apples. She found a cast iron pan of appropriate weight, and set it on the stove, and let it come to heat. And the smell of apples and brown sugar and cinnamon moving through a cold kitchen was the smell of something being rescued, which she did not editorialize about, because she did not need to. She put the food on the table, and they ate. He ate the way a man eats who has been forgetting to eat, not ravenous but steady, like a man refilling something that had gone empty without his noticing. She watched him, then looked away. Outside, the light was going. October light went early and fast, like it had somewhere to be. After they ate, he washed the dishes, which she had not expected, and she sat at the table and let him. She stayed in the borrowed cabin that night, and Jesse Holt rode home to the mountain and came back in the morning with Rosie on the saddle in front of him. And Rosie walked into the kitchen without knocking, in the manner of a child who has decided that a space belongs to her, and put a flat, smooth river stone on the table in front of Mabel. "I found it last spring," Rosie said. "I was saving it for something." Mabel looked at the stone. It was gray with a single white line running through it, unbroken from one side to the other. "It's a good one," she said. "I know," said Rosie. She stayed for 3 more days in the cabin, and Jesse came each morning with Rosie and each evening without her. And on the 4th morning Mabel put on her ordinary clothes and packed her trunk, and told him she would go back to her rooms at the boarding house and they could begin again properly, without a church, and without a dress, and without an audience. He nodded. Then he said, "Come to the property first. I want to show you something." They rode up together, Mabel on the borrowed mare, and Jesse on his own horse and Rosie between them, chattering with the particular industry of a child who understands that the adults need something to fill the silence and has appointed herself to the task. The property climbed the eastern slope of the mountain and settled into a natural shelf of land that looked out over the valley the way a man looks out at something he built, with a quiet, private satisfaction that doesn't require an audience. The kitchen was a catastrophe, not from neglect, or not only from neglect, it was the kitchen of a man who had learned to cook out of necessity rather than desire, and who had stopped pretending otherwise. The shelves were functional. The stove worked. Everything else was an argument for starting over. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "I can see what you want to show me," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She set down her things. "Where's the flour?" She made bread. Rosie sat on the counter and handed her things and provided an ongoing commentary on the household that was more informative than anything Jessie had told her voluntarily. Who the neighbors were, which of the barn cats had recently had kittens, why the fence on the north side needed fixing, what her father ate when he thought no one was watching, which was apparently crackers and coffee, and nothing else worth mentioning. Jessie worked somewhere outside. She could hear him intermittently. Rosie talked. The bread rose. She found the locked trunk while she was cleaning the shelf above the stove, a small, cedar-lined thing pushed to the back corner that she immediately left alone. But she had seen the edge of a photograph visible, where the lid did not quite close, and she had recognized, from the angle she had seen, that the photograph was of a woman. She said nothing. She filed it away the way she filed things, precisely, in order, for later consideration. Jessie's first gesture came that afternoon, and she almost missed it. She had been straining to reach the high shelf on the west wall of the kitchen, too high for her by 2 inches, not enough to require a chair if she had the reach, which she did not. And she heard him come in from outside, and before she could turn, his arm came past her shoulder and set the tin she had been reaching for on the counter beside her. He stepped back immediately. He said nothing. She said nothing. They stood in the kitchen for a moment with that between them, and then he went back outside. Rosie accepted her on the 7th day in the manner of a child who has been conducting a quiet and rigorous evaluation and has arrived at a verdict. She had been sick with a cold since the 4th day, nothing serious, but enough to keep her inside and close. And Mabel had been the one to sit with her through the 2 bad nights, making broth and keeping the fire even, and reading to her from the one book on the shelf until Rosie fell asleep against her arm. On the 7th morning, Rosie came downstairs, still red-nosed, and announced without preamble that she thought Mabel should put her room above the kitchen because it was warmer, and that the school needed more books, and that she, Rosie, would like to learn to make bread. Jessie stood in the doorway and heard all of this. He looked at Mabel over Rosie's head for a moment. He put a stack of firewood outside her door that evening. 8 pieces. More than the night needed. What Ida Marsh was doing in town, Mabel knew in general and preferred not to know in particular. She gathered enough from the women at the Mercantile, a series of glances exchanged too quickly. A question asked in a tone of concern that contained no actual concern, to understand that Ida was conducting a campaign that was moving through Copper Falls the way weather moves, changing the temperature of rooms before it arrived in them. She had been doing this for 2 years. She was experienced at it. She had the advantage of grief as her credential. She was the dead woman's sister, which meant that any defense Jessie mounted would read, to certain people, as an offense against his first wife's memory. It was a neat trap. What Mabel had not expected was the letter. She found it on the 15th day. It was addressed to the school board, in Ida's hand, and its contents had been summarized for Mabel by the schoolhouse's janitor, a kind, embarrassed old man named Webb, who thought she should know. The letter argued that Mabel's continued residence at the Holt property, unmarried, constituted conduct unbecoming of a schoolteacher, and requested that the board consider her contract. It was, Mabel understood. Not an argument against her size or her person. Ida was too careful for that. It was an argument against her character, which was the argument that could actually do damage. She told Jesse that evening. He listened with the quality of attention that was one of the things she had come to find most reliable about him. The sense that he was not formulating his response while she spoke, but actually taking in what she was saying first. "The school board meets Friday," he said. "I know. I'll speak to them." "It won't help," she said. "Not from you." Not with Ida's argument. She folded her hands at the wrist. "There's something else." The something else was this. Mabel had been keeping notes. Not with any particular intention when she started. She was a teacher, and note-keeping was reflex. But over 14 days she had written down, with dates and names where she had them, the things that had been said to her or about her in public in Copper Falls, the comments at the Mercantile, the two she had overheard at the post office, the thing the young man had said at the church that she had not included in her accounting until now. She had written them plainly. Name, date, content, 11 entries. She had also written down the names of 3 women in Copper Falls who had experienced the same kind of campaign, not from Ida specifically, but from the same machinery of social pressure, and who had left their positions or their homes or their plans as a result. She had their names from Webb, who had been janitor at the schoolhouse for 19 years and had a long memory. "The board won't care about comments at the Mercantile," Jesse said. "No," said Mabel. "But they'll care about a pattern." The school board meeting on Friday was open, which it always was, which meant that by 9 o'clock in the morning most of Copper Falls knew it was happening, and by 11 most of them had found reasons to be in the vicinity of the schoolhouse. Ida Marsh arrived early and sat in the front row with the particular stillness of a woman who has rehearsed. Mabel arrived with Jesse and Rosie and Webb, the janitor, and the 3 women whose names she had written down, all of whom had agreed, with varying degrees of willingness, to be present. The board heard Ida first. She was composed and precise, and she deployed grief with expert accuracy, the sister left behind, the child who needed stability, the memory of a woman who had loved this community. She did not say a single thing about Mabel's body. She did not have to. The implication was structural. It was built into the architecture of what she had been saying around town for 2 weeks. When it was Mabel's turn, she stood. She did not look at Ida. She looked at the 3 board members who were trying to look neutral and managing it with varying success. She said, "I have 11 documented incidents over 14 days, names, dates, and content in writing, which I will submit to the board." She paused. "I also have 3 women in this room who have been through similar campaigns conducted in this town, and who are willing to speak to what they experienced." Another pause. "The question before this board is not my conduct. My conduct is not in question. The question is whether this board will allow the documented harassment of a teacher to succeed in removing her from her position." She looked at Ida then, once, briefly. "I'll leave that determination to them." She sat down. The room was quiet. Outside, through the schoolhouse's single window, the October wind was working at the remaining leaves. Jesse Holt stood. He was not a man who made speeches. He had said perhaps 300 words to Mabel in the first 2 weeks she had been staying at the property, and he had said perhaps 300 more in all the weeks before that, across the entire course of their acquaintance. He stood in front of the school board of Copper Falls in his good coat, and the room was full of people who had watched Mabel Crane walk back down that church aisle 12 days ago. And he used his words the way he had learned to use everything, without waste. "I failed her in that church," he said. I want the people in this room to hear me say that plainly. I failed her. I knew what was being said around town, and I stayed quiet, and I should not have. He looked at the board. I'm asking you to do what I didn't. This woman is the best teacher this school has had, and she's the only honest person in this room who has written anything down. Give her the consideration she's owed. He sat down. Rosie, who was 7 years old and had been sitting quietly for 45 minutes in the manner of a child who is expending enormous energy on good behavior, reached across and put her hand over Mabel's on the bench. She did not say anything. She left her hand there. The board deliberated for 11 minutes. Mabel counted them. The verdict was not complicated. Her contract would stand. Ida's letter would not be entered into the record. The board chairman used the phrase insufficient grounds in the tone of a man who wished he could say more, but had decided against it. What happened outside the schoolhouse was not planned. Ida left first, quickly, in the manner of a woman who has decided that a dignified exit is the only remaining option. The crowd that had gathered outside was the same crowd that had been in the pews 3 Sundays ago, more or less, and they moved aside for her without quite looking at her directly, which told Mabel something about the direction things had shifted. She came out of the schoolhouse with Rosie's hand still in hers, and at the bottom of the schoolhouse steps there was a patch of ice. Early for October, but October in the high country made its own schedule, and she did not see it until her boot came down on it and went sideways. It was not a fall. It was a near fall, caught before it happened, and what caught it was Jesse Holt's arm around her, there before she had finished deciding she was going to fall. He righted her. He kept his arm where it was for a moment while she found her footing. And then, in front of the crowd that was watching, in front of the women from the pews and the board members on the step, and Webb the janitor who was already smiling, and the young man from the back row who had covered his mouth 3 Sundays ago, and who had the grace to look away, Jesse Holt looked at Mabel Crane, and he kept his arm around her, and he said, quietly and with no audience in mind, "All right?" "All right," she said. He did not remove his arm. He walked her to the wagon that way, and helped her up, and Rosie climbed up on the other side and pressed against Mabel's arm immediately, as though this were already a habit. The people of Copper Falls watched. Some of them understood what they were seeing. Some of them would understand it later. He carried her, in the end, the way the title of this story promises, not across a threshold, not as a gesture, but 2 weeks later on the mountain road when the gelding pulled up lame in a November sleet storm, and she had been the one walking it home and had turned her ankle in a rut she had not seen in the dark. He came down the road on foot, with a lantern, having heard the horses changed gait from the barn, and he found her there, and he assessed the situation with the economy of a man who does not ask unnecessary questions in emergencies, and he handed her the lantern and picked her up. She was not a small woman. He was aware of this, and she was aware of this, and neither of them said a single word about it. He carried her the remaining 1/4 mile to the cabin, with the sleet coming sideways off the mountain, and she held the lantern to light the road, and Rosie opened the door before they reached it, having heard them coming, and they came in out of the storm together. He set her down on the chair by the stove and looked at her ankle without speaking, and his hands on her boot were careful. He confirmed it was not broken. He brought her a cloth soaked in cold water and told her to keep it elevated, and he made coffee, which was not as good as hers, and he put it in front of her without apology. She drank it. They were married the following March, in the cabin and not the church, with Rosie standing between them and Webb the janitor as witness, and Reverend Albright, who had thought carefully about it and decided he was glad to be asked. There were no pews. There was no audience. There was bread she had made that morning, the starters still going strong, and coffee and canned peaches, and Rosie wore her best dress, and a ribbon she had chosen herself. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, running its enormous, patient operations without consulting the small, warm things that had decided to make their lives at its foot. It had seen worse winters. It would see worse still. It covered what it covered and uncovered it again in the spring, and it did not have opinions about the size of the things that moved through it. Mabel Holt did not have opinions about it either. She had something better. She had Rosie's hand at breakfast, and the river stone on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, and a man who had learned, at some cost to his pride and hers, that saying something plainly at the right moment is not a small thing, and who had since been practicing. She had a school with more books than it had started with. She had a starter that her daughter, the one who arrived in 1889, and was named for no one in particular, because Mabel felt she deserved a name that was entirely her own, would one day press into her own daughter's hands. She had never asked permission to be the size she was. She had been asked in various ways, by various people, to take up less space, and she had listened politely and continued exactly as she was, because she had arrived at a private accounting of her own worth that was not subject to public revision. Copper Falls had wanted her smaller. She had declined,